Well, good afternoon. Welcome to the Woodrow Wilson Center. Since we're being webcast and we're speaking not only to those of you in the room, but those of you in the great beyond as well, let me just say a word or two, if I may, about the Wilson Center. The Woodrow Wilson Center is the nation's official memorial to President Woodrow Wilson. It seeks to commemorate President Wilson's twin interests in scholarship and in public policy. As some of you may know, President Wilson had a long and very distinguished career in the academic world, culminating with the presidency of Princeton, prior to entering politics, first as governor of New Jersey and then 2 terms as president of the United States. And the Wilson Center seeks to bridge those two worlds by bringing the best scholarly work that's being produced today, making it available in a user-friendly fashion, not only to other academics, and indeed there are many academics in this room today, but also to a broader community, including the policy community. I can see in this room also a number of people from that community. So we're delighted to have you in the room and you beyond the room. This is an occasion of particular pleasure for the Wilson Center and for the Asia program, because we are welcoming back to the center, not for the second time, but for the third time, someone who is a longtime friend of the Wilson Center, and indeed more than just a friend. Once upon a time, many years ago, when David Shambaugh was not nearly as distinguished as he has become since then, he served on the staff of the Wilson Center and is acting director of the Asia program. Many years later, he came back and was a fellow here. And during that fellowship year, he wrote the book that we are going to hear about in just a minute. David is, as you no doubt know, a professor of political science and international affairs at the Elliott School of International Affairs in George Washington University. He also is the director of the China Policy program at the Elliott School. He is one of this country's most distinguished China experts. The list of his publications is lengthy, and indeed far too lengthy for me to recount today, because those of you in the room have already picked up his bio and you've seen a number of the publications. At any rate, David did his graduate work at the University of Michigan, holds a PhD in political science. David, we are delighted to have you back here today. We are delighted to use this occasion to celebrate the publication of your new book. We're particularly pleased because the Wilson Center Press published it. We feel some sense of paternal pride. Before turning the podium over to David, let me simply inform or remind you that immediately outside this door is a bookseller, and you'll have an opportunity to get your own copy of this book. They make terrific Easter gifts, Christmas gifts, 4th of July gifts. David and our publisher would both be grateful if you would take home 6 copies each. David, welcome to the Wilson Center. The floor is yours.
Well, Bob, thank you very much for that very generous and warm introduction. Hadn't thought about the book as an Easter gift exactly, but not a bad idea. Well, let me start just by saying what a distinct pleasure it is to give my first book launch. I think the term is for these book launch lectures. I'm going to give a few subsequently, but I wanted to make sure that the first one was here at the Wilson Center because the book incubated here, if you will, during the 2002-2003 academic year when I was a fellow. And if you haven't, many of you in the audience have been or are now fellows and residents at the Wilson Center. It's one of the great pleasures of academic life, actually, to get away from our normal institutions and spend a year in residence here. For me, it afforded a real year of reading and reflection and some writing. This book got started here, but it didn't get finished here. It took five more years subsequently, and another grant from the Smith Richardson Foundation, who I should also thank, before it came to fruition. But I do want to thank you, Bob, and the Asia program for hosting me that year. It was a wonderful year to be in residence here. I see my colleague Chung Lee was also in residence that year, and we became very good friends and colleagues as a result of that. But also the other fellows that you interact with and the professional staff here at the Wilson Center, not the least of which is Lee Hamilton, the director. I think I must have had 15 or 20 lunchtime conversations that year with Lee before the 9/11 Commission, but it was a real privilege and joy. And lastly, I'd like to thank Joe Brinley and the Wilson Center Press and Millie Kahn for publishing the book, or co-publishing the book, along with the University of California, although all the hard work was done here by the Wilson Center Press. California is now marketing it, but it is a joint project between the two presses, and so I wanted to give the first launch lecture for these reasons here at the Wilson Center, and I thank you all for coming. I'm going to try and give a sort of 45-minute or so overview of the book, and hence the subject, China's Communist Party, no small subject, no small party, world's largest political party, 73.4 million members. But this book is about more than the Chinese Communist Party. It is a book about the generic phenomenon of communist party states. In fact, China is the case study. It is, at least I attempted in it, to look beyond the case study and to contextualize and understand the Chinese Communist Party in the context of Leninist party states. This is an interest I've had going back to my university days, both undergraduate and graduate, and I've been influenced along the way by a number of very fine professors, in fact, to whom I've dedicated the book. I realized when I got to the end of the book that the writing of it was really kind of a 20-year evolution of my own studies and thinking, and a lot of professors and colleagues, such as Bruce Dixon, who's here, have influenced my thinking about Leninist parties as peculiar, and they are peculiar, types of political parties. I was also very intrigued by the causes of the collapse of the former Soviet Union and the East European Communist Party states from 89 to 91, what caused their collapses, and why the Chinese Communist Party has endured when those others did not, and whether, in fact, it will continue to endure, and what it's going to take to do so. So those were sort of the animating questions. Now, my whole sort of previous professional career and writings have all been China-centric. This is the first time I've sort of strayed off the reservation and tried to do something comparative. But I hope when you read the book, that will come through. It is an attempt to understand Leninist parties, how they evolve, what rather predictable stages they pass through, and where, and to locate the Chinese Communist Party on that continuum, and hence to anticipate the kinds of current and future challenges the Chinese Communist Party, the CCP, is experiencing at present or is going to experience. That's not to say that there is some sort of predictable pathway that all communist parties have to follow sequentially and wind up as the Soviet Union did. Indeed, of those that collapsed, they each collapsed for some of their own intrinsic reasons as well as some more common generic reasons that they shared. And the Chinese Communist Party shares some generic features that these other former Communist Party states did, but it has its own unique Chinese characteristics, as they are fond of saying. So the Wilson Center Fellowship gave me a year to read into this literature, not about China, but about the East European and the Soviet party states, the Slavic studies field. And that was really enjoyable, I must say. It was a fascinating experience, not just what they had to say about the causes of collapse of those party states, but it was kind of an interesting window into the sociology of that field, the Slavic studies field. I'm in the Chinese studies field. And it was very interesting to sort of look at how our cousins in the comparative communist studies family, if you will, looked at their object of study, but particularly after their object of study collapsed. What do they have to do? What do they say about their former analyses? What do they say about each other? So there was a kind of post-mortem. When I was here in residence, there was a sort of post-mortem in that field about causes of collapse, but there was also a lot of finger-pointing and a lot of sort of criticisms amongst Soviet and East European scholars of each other. And if you go and read this literature, it's really quite interesting and made me think about that field in comparison to the China field. It made me realize that, in fact, that field and the China field are not dissimilar. There are a lot of debates and some finger-pointing in our field. It's often been said that China specialists tend to love and like their country, while Soviet specialists hate theirs. I've heard that a number of times. I don't know if it's true or not, but indeed the China field during the last decade or so has certainly been replete with rather animated discourse and debates about their object of study, namely China and the Chinese Communist Party. But I would observe one thing I've noticed in reading the Soviet East European literature versus the China literature. Soviet East European specialists tended to look at their object of study in a more holistic and systemic way than China specialists do. China field has, I think, quite regrettably, deconstructed to its detriment. We know more and more about less and less about China. Nobody is writing about big subjects, about the totality of China or the Chinese Communist Party as a whole, which is why I wanted to do this book. Yet you find books on all kinds of very micro topics, which, as may illuminate us about that micro topic, but don't tell us a whole lot about China, I would submit. So I wanted to try and step back, and I noticed that our Soviet Russia and East European colleagues didn't do that. They didn't deconstruct their field in the way the China field has. Now, maybe they didn't have access to the data that China people do, China scholars do. I'm not sure what the reasons are. But I would implore those in our field of Chinese studies to begin to put the pieces of the puzzle back together and ask big questions about China with a capital C. That will lead necessarily to some overgeneralizations. And I would also encourage the China field to think comparatively. And so this study is an attempt to do that, to see the Chinese Communist Party comparatively vis-a-vis other Leninist or former Leninist parties. And third, I was very interested in how the Chinese Communist Party itself interpreted the collapse of the former Soviet Union East European party states, because I assumed there had to be a lot of not just hand-wringing. Once they got past the hand-wringing, and we know in 1989, 90, 91, there was an awful lot of hand-wringing inside the Zhongnan High in Beijing about these collapses. Once they got past that stage, though, and became more analytical about the causes of collapse, I figured there had to be some really interesting discourse inside China on that subject. So I started to dig around and scratch around, and little did I know what I would stumble into. This is an enormous field of analysis that has stretched quite literally from 1989 to this present day. It still goes on. Although I would say that it came, and I argue in the book, it came to an official end in 2004 with the fourth plenum of the 16th Party Congress. If you read the communique of the fourth plenum of the 16th Party Congress, you'll find basically the official assessment about why the Soviet Union went down. It took them 15 years to come to that official conclusion. But even before that official conclusion, there was a broad spectrum of debate inside the Chinese Communist Party, inside other institutions, non-party institutions, universities, think tanks inside China. So I was curious about what this discourse was. And so that was the third major thing that made me write this book. The fourth major, and lastly, the thing that stimulated me was what lessons, therefore, did the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party, draw from their own analysis of the collapse of the Soviet Union, and B, their own introspection about their own situation? It's not that the CCP was only looking to the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, they were simultaneously doing a very thorough assessment of their own so-called ruling capacity. Zhezheng Nengli is the term. So these, and to what extent, I was wondering, are their new reforms in recent years a result of their analysis of what brought down these other systems? That was these were the animating questions that I went into this study with. And have found, in fact, that there are a number of political reforms that the CCP is still, present tense, undertaking, and has been undertaking since the mid-90s, and particularly since 2004. I really point you to this fourth plenum as the key meeting. In fact, the most important meeting, I think, since the third plenum of 1978, which all Chinese hold up as the most important meeting in our party's history. And it will be the 30th anniversary this December of that meeting. But look at the fourth, go back, if you're interested in this stuff, go back and read the communique from the fourth plenum. So what I have found is that the CCP has indeed fashioned its reforms, and it is a reforming institution, I would argue. It's not a stagnant institution, on the lessons that it has learned from the Soviet East European cases, but also non-communist systems. That's something else I hadn't really expected to find and didn't go into this study really thinking about. But lo and behold, I stumbled into a literature of Chinese assessments of East Asian authoritarian states and those that have transitioned from authoritarian to some form of democracy. Certainly a big literature on the color revolutions in Central Asia. A rather large literature on Latin American corporatist systems, smaller literature on Middle Eastern, what you might call authoritarian dynasties, like Syria's Assad dynasty. They studied until he was overthrown, Saddam Hussein's Iraq, quite carefully, post-revolutionary Iran, and in some considerable depth, Western and Northern European social democratic systems. So the CCP has not just been looking at the negative lessons, if you will, of the collapsed Soviet East European cases, but they've been looking at the positive lessons, if you will, of these other types of systems literally all over the globe, and have been borrowing, I would argue, and that's the central argument of the book. What we see the CCP becoming today is an eclectic party, a hybrid party, in which it is taking bits and pieces from what they've learned of these other systems and grafting it onto their Leninist roots. Indeed, beneath the Leninist roots lie Chinese political culture. As Lucian Pai has pointed out, Leninism grew very well in Confucian soil in China. And so that's another story. But the argument of the book is that the CCP is becoming a new type of political system. It is a dynamic, evolving, changing institution. It's not a static or stagnant or dead party, as other scholars in this town argue. And it's undertaking a number of reforms for both these external reasons as well as their internal assessments. So these four sets of questions are what animate this book. Chapter 1, you can read the book for yourself, but Chapter 1 is a sort of overview of the central argument that the party is in a simultaneous state of atrophy and adaptation. That is the subtitle of the book. And it's a simultaneous state. It's not a mutually exclusive state. The party has been, and I'll explain in a minute, in the state of atrophy for some time. The adaptation is more recent. Chapter 2 examines the Western scholarly discourse, all that stuff that I read when I was here in residence that year in the so-called field of comparative communism and Slavic studies, and about about Leninist parties and the stages they passed through and why the Soviet Union, East European states went down. Chapter 3 shifts and examines the scholarship by China scholars of the Chinese Communist Party in recent years. And by the way, the time frame for this book is 1989 to the present. It's post-Tiananmen up to this year. In fact, the book was in press. Joe Brindley will remember that I even wrote into the contract that if the 17th Party Congress does something dramatic that changes the arguments of the book, that I had the right to revise appropriately. Fortunately, the 17th Party Congress last fall did not do anything radical. In fact, it confirmed everything in the book and everything they'd been doing. It confirmed everything they'd been doing that I'd been writing about since the 16th Congress. So that was a relief. You always worry as an author that the object of your study is going to pull a fast one on you before your book gets out into public. Didn't happen. So the third chapter looks at the really broad spectrum, and I was surprised to find this, of analyses by Western China specialists about the state of the Chinese Communist Party. And this is a book, by the way, about the party, not Chinese politics. It's not about the government. It's not about the state council. It's not about local government. It's not about provincial government. It's about the party as a single institution. So that's something that you need to, those who read it need to sort of understand from the outset. And I stumbled upon a really surprising range of views in our community of China watchers about the state of the CCP. There's another very good book coming out next month from Brookings Institution that Chung Lee is editing that I think really shows this range of views. There are those, well, I'll get to that in a second, who think the party's days are numbered, those who think it has a long time to go. Chapter 4 shifts, and chapter 4 is really the heart of the book. It shifts to the Chinese discourse on the evolution and collapse of the Soviet Union, East European states, and the color revolutions in Central Asia. Longest chapter in the book, about 70 pages. Chapter 5 looks at the CCP study of non-communist systems in Asia, Europe, Middle East, and Latin America. So the first 4 chapters, or 5 chapters, are about discourses, parallel discourses in the West and in China. Then I shift in 6 and 7 to look at lessons, if you will, and how the CCP, what the CCP has been doing to try and reinvent, reinstitutionalize itself and to save itself from implosion, basically. And chapter 6 looks at this in theoretical terms, ideological terms, what they're doing in the realm of theory, how they're trying to explain to themselves what they're doing. Chapter 7 looks at what they're actually doing in the party. There's much more that could have gone into this book beyond what went into 6 and 7. In fact, I have another book that will look at that in more detail in the pipeline. But 6 and 7 try to shift to practice from discourse. And then there is a concluding chapter 8 that asks the question, can the CCP survive? That's, after all, the bottom line question, what we all wonder. And I examine a number of predictions and analyses of my colleagues in the field, and I hope I've been fair to them. And I'd like you to stay till the end of the lecture. But my bottom line answer is yes, the CCP can survive and has survived and is surviving because of its adaptive nature. So, you know, that's where you locate me in the sinological universe. I'm in that end of the spectrum, along with Joe Fewsmith and some others. But there is disagreement here in our field. Just to locate you, I am in disagreement with Roderick McFarquhar, Min-Shin Pei, Susan Shirk, Richard Baum, Gordon Jung, Bruce Gilley, Wang Xiaoguang, Arthur Waldron, and Willie Lam, all of whom predict the collapse of the Chinese Communist Party. In fact, many of them have been predicting it for a number of years. I won't name names, but many of them are located in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Ross. Why? But, you know, they've been predicting that the CCP's days are numbered, and it's just a matter of time and circumstances, and the whole thing is going to come crashing down. I'm also in disagreement, I hate to say it, Li Cheng, with your predictions and Zheng Yongnian and Bruce Gilley's and Merle Goldman's that there will be a democratic breakthrough. All 4 of you get to democratic breakthrough, but by different paths, in the near medium-term future. But I find myself in agreement with Andrew Walder, Andrew Nathan, Bruce Dixon, Tony Sach, Ken Lieberthal, Dolly Young, Bob Scalapino, Mike Lampton, and Kjell-Erik Brodsgaard, all of whom, and I must say, Jim Mann, this is going to surprise you if you've read Jim Mann's new book, The China Fantasy. I disagree with much of the book and really dislike it for a number of reasons, but the conclusion is, Mann's conclusion, that the United States has to live with an enduring CCP. So we come out the same, and he argues that Americans have been deluding themselves, that like the first group that I mentioned, that the CCP's days are numbered. So in that sense, Mann is with this last cohort that I described, who believe that the CCP is either muddling through. There are two sub-schools within this cohort. Those are kind of muddling through. That's the Tony Sach school in particular. Or the proactive adaptation school, which I would argue Andrew Nathan, Bruce Dixon, Ken Lieberthal in particular associate themselves, and Kjeld Erik Brodsgaard in Denmark. That there is, in Nathan's terms, the CCP is enjoying an authoritarian resilience, is his terminology, and I think it's quite appropriate. So that's what the book's about. That's sort of, and I try and examine as objectively as possible. I've had to do a lot of reading in the China field and thinking also in the Soviet field. So the study, let me now get into the study a little bit. The book itself argues, or tries to demonstrate anyway empirically, that after a period of catharsis after 1989 and the Tiananmen crackdown and the subsequent collapses of the Soviet East European systems, as I say, after they got through that period of angst, that they then began to more objectively analyze the reasons for those collapses and their own situation. And this process of understanding those precipitous causes was infused with a real immediacy. They were in danger of going down too. There were, obviously Tiananmen brought many of these challenges to the surface. It was a frontal confrontation on the party state by the society. So the party even had that understanding and decided to take an intensive look at itself and at the Soviet East European cases. Interestingly, as I read their discourse in Chapter 4 compared to the Western analysis by the Slavic studies community, one difference became apparent. The Western, this is a big generalization I'm about to make, but the Western community all blamed the Soviet collapse on Gorbachev, basically, for one reason or another. One of Gorbachev's moves or another of Gorbachev's moves. But had it not been for Gorbachev, the Soviet Union never would have come down. Chinese analysis, if you read it internally, much more historical, much more holistic, much more systemic. They argued that the Soviet Union had been in atrophy since Stalin, and even during Stalin. And funny little twists come out in these discourses. Khrushchev is now viewed by the Chinese as the first great Soviet reformer, and had he not been overthrown, they don't say what role Chairman Mao might have had in that or how the Chinese looked upon the Soviet Union at that time, but they argue that the Soviet Union's deterioration started after the certainly overthrow of Khrushchev on through Chernenko, Brezhnev, and drop-off they thought had some potentiality. But then, so the Chinese analysis is that by the time Gorbachev came to power, it was too late. And what he did was tactically wrong, but strategically correct. So the way he went about it, not pursuing incremental reform, as they in China had been doing. Gorbachev, tried to pursue political and economic reform in tandem, rather than economic reform first and political reform very much second. And he tried the Big Bang approach to economic reform. He didn't really know what he was doing in terms of economic reform, he or his advisors. A lot of very complicated analysis the Chinese gave to the Soviet case. And then they also began to realize that all the East European party states didn't go down for the same reason. And they began to look more carefully at the GDR, subject I've become very interested in, the Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Poland. Each of them had their own causes, and that began to be reflected in the Chinese writings. Okay, so this kind of analysis that the Chinese did led to the reforms that they have been undertaking, as I say, since '04, if not before. And these reforms are hard to measure and hard to see. A lot of Western China specialists don't see them. A lot of journalists certainly don't see them. And I would say that if you went out and did a survey on the streets of Washington, ask, is China politically reforming, you would get 99.9% response, no. But in fact, I argue in the book that the CCP is very much reforming in a number of ways. But it's not reforming in ways that are easily noticeable, and it's certainly not becoming proto-democratic, and there seems to be an assumption a lot of Western, here Jim Mann is also correct, in a lot of Western analysis that if it's not proto-democratic and kind of moving along this transition, this inevitable end of history transition to democratic statehood, that it's not real reform. But the CCP has absolutely zero interest in transitioning to a democratic system of competitive parties, I would argue. Although it is doing a lot to try and make their own single party much more democratic, both within itself and between itself and society. And thirdly, between itself and the other so-called democratic parties in China. There are 8 other parties in China which have been United Front tools to date, but I think one of the more significant reforms that they're trying to undertake is to strengthen the so-called CPPCC, the Chinese People's Political Consultative Congress, which is in session, or was in session last week. And to get the CPPCC more involved in the CCP policymaking process, which I can describe in greater detail if you're interested. So the Chinese believe that they are democratizing. They point to 3 types of democracy that they are undertaking. Inter-party democracy, 党内民主, consultative democracy, 社上民主, and this multi-party cooperation, 多党合作, it's called. Now, we may not recognize that as democracy because it's not rooted in competitive party systems, but I would submit that it has some democratic elements in terms of process. So these reforms are not noticed by that many scholars. Bruce has noticed some of them, Joe Fewsmith some of them, but they're generally not noticed, and they're oftentimes dismissed by the scholars that do notice them. What is for sure, I would argue, in the book, is that the CCP is not, is sitting on its hands awaiting some kind of inevitable collapse, as beset these other countries. It has undertaken its period of introspection, and it has now moved into its phase of implementing. It's drawn the lessons, and now it's moving to implement those lessons. Okay, so that's basically the main argument. Adaptation is more important than atrophy, or it's at least a simultaneous process. But indeed, China, and that wouldn't be fair to say if the Chinese Communist Party is not and has not been in a state of atrophy. It has been. The question is, when did it start and how serious is it? Some would date it from 1958. Some would date it from 1966. Some would date it from the post-78 reforms, others from 1989. Whatever date you select, there are a wide variety of indicators to show that the party as an institution has been in a state of progressive decline in terms of its control over various aspects of intellectual, social, economic, and political life of the nation. But this atrophy, if you will, and decline control has been a conscious move by the party to decentralize power. After all, this is what rolling back the Maoist state was all about, to decentralize power and to decentralize incentives and the economy. Now, they have not, they are now decentralizing politics too. That is what I think is really at the heart of the party reform program at the moment, inside a one-party system, to be sure. So the tools of party control, if you will, have atrophied over time, from a more or less totalistic, to use Zodang's term, or totalitarian state to a much weaker authoritarian state. Now, to be sure, globalization and China's integration into the international economy And society has contributed to that in ways the Soviet Union never had to deal with. And Soviet Union would have come down probably a lot faster had it been integrated into the international system. So atrophy, yes. Number of indicators, widespread corruption, social stratification, inequality, pervasive unemployment, rising crime, rural unrest, and so on, all point to a party that is in trouble. So I'm not standing here to tell you it's not in trouble, but I am standing here to tell you they know it's in trouble and that they have been undertaking different steps to try and reinstitutionalize, reinvent, and save itself. So, and that's probably the most important conclusion they have come to from the analysis of the Soviet Party, that an ossified party state with a dogmatic ideology, entrenched elites who never retire, dormant party organizations, a stagnant economy that is isolated from the world community is a sure recipe for collapse. So take each of those 6 things I just mentioned and ask yourself about China. Is the economy stagnant? Are the party organizations, is their ideology dogmatic? No. Are the elites entrenched? No. Forced retirement? Are the party organizations dormant? Some, but they're trying to revive them. Is the economy growing? Yes. Is China cut off from the world community? No. So completely, very clear conclusions, I think. It didn't take the collapse of the Soviet Union to get to those conclusions. Deng Xiaoping, all of those conclusions, I should say. Deng Xiaoping understood in 1978 that China needed to do these things. And indeed, China and the party in 78 was very much as the Soviet Communist Party was when it finally came down. So the reforms predate 89 in this book. The book simply picks up sort of in the middle of that story, but particularly after the catharsis of the Tiananmen movement. Okay, so adaptation is really the key concept of this study. Atrophy on one side, but adaptation. And I would argue in the book that political parties, even communist ones, need to adapt if they're going to survive. Otherwise, they will more than atrophy. They will ossify and die. So, like plants, I guess they need. I don't know if the metaphor is correct. They need sunlight and nutrition, and that's what the CCP has been undertaking. And it's, I think, an unprecedented historical movement or experiment, really, what they're trying to do. They don't, whether there is a blueprint somewhere in the drawer of the Central Committee in the Zhongnan High that says this is where we're going and this is how we're going to get there, I doubt. If there is, I haven't seen it. It hasn't been leaked to me, at least. But they're doing in the political realm, I submit, what they are doing in every other sphere in China, economic, higher education, you name it. Incrementalism, testing, experimental testing in certain what they call key points, borrowing from abroad, selective borrowing, and creating a kind of unique hybrid, just like the Chinese economy is a unique hybrid. So I'm arguing the Chinese political system is becoming a unique hybrid that has elements of, I've already told you, Latin American corporatism, East Asian neo-authoritarianism, and West European social democracy. Even though they haven't moved in this direction, looked at federalism, American federalism, Canadian federalism, Australian federalism, and German federalism. But they haven't yet moved in that direction. Of course, we know that is what Yan Jieqi, for example, argued for in his own book. And you might argue they have de facto federalism, not de jure federalism. So one has to ask, are these lessons going to be sufficient to the totality of the problems that China confronts today and that the party in particular confronts today? And I would argue no. It's important for them to study all these foreign systems, particularly the Leninist systems, and they've, I think, drawn the right, conclusions, right or not. I mean, they have said, they've looked at solidarity in Poland and said we must not, under any conditions, enfranchise autonomous trade unions. They have looked at looked at Havel and what the civil society in Czechoslovakia and in Hungary and said under no conditions must we give truly autonomous civil society and NGOs the chance to grow. And they've looked at the state of the Soviet Union in the ways I've described and said we should not go down that path, either the pre-Gorbachev or the Gorbachev path. So those are all what I call the negative lessons, and they've learned more positive lessons, though, from these other non-communist systems. And that's important because China, I would argue, is now at a new stage of development. Quite literally, the transition from being a developing society to being a newly industrialized state. So we scholars, now I've got to go off and come back as a fellow Bob and write another book. I need to read the literature on newly industrialized states, the South Koreas of this world, the Taiwans of this world, the Argentinas of this world, the Brazils of this world, and so on, to understand better the challenges that those countries faced as they moved into that phase of development. I would argue China is moving into that phase of development now. And as such, is already encountering a number of the same problems that are generic to newly industrialized country NIC status, such as dramatic income disparities and social stratification becoming pronounced, rent seeking and exploitation by owner classes becoming widespread, flourishing corruption, both at the local and the national state levels, resulting in predatory practices by officials. All of this comes under the sort of rubric of Latin Americanization. Some people have written, in fact, that China's present is already revealing the Latin Americanization phenomenon. But what countries that enter this phase all confront in common, and what I think is the major challenge to the CCP going forward, are the delivery of public goods. Basically what happens when you move into this phase, as I understand it, is that people's sort of personal livelihood has reached an acceptable level. Their disposable income, their opportunities for travel, their consumer durables, and so on. And then they begin to start asking for not so much quantitative elements of life as qualitative improvements in life. They want better health, education, welfare, environment, and good governance. And so the question going forward is, and I think it's pretty fair to say that's what Chinese, if you read the Chinese press and go to China and even read the government's own policy pronouncement, not least of which is Wen Jiabao's report to the National People's Congress last week, or Hu Jintao's report to the 17th Party Congress last October. It's all about the delivery of these, what we call public goods. So the question is, if you accept that, if this is the major challenge going forward for the party, can the party deliver the public goods? And here I would argue that Leninist parties, in fact, I just read a very interesting article last night in the new issue of The National Interest by Dali Yang, who has written a very good book on the regulatory state. Anyway, the question is, are Leninist parties more or less able to deliver public goods to their populations? On the one hand, Dali Yang argues, and it's true, that they are more able because they can centralize. They have a centralized capacity that democracies don't have. If they really put their minds to it and bureaucratically organize to deliver something, and Dali Yang, for example, argues several cases in this article. Air traffic safety, for example. Think how many plane crashes there were in China in the 80s and the 90s until the China Avionic Administration decided to get serious about air safety. We know about lead paint on toys last year. Well, he argues that they are getting very serious on this issue. Lead paint and, well, they haven't gotten efficient on IPR infringement. So there are a lot of, it's selective enforcement is the bottom line. It's when the state decides to put its mind and resources to doing something in China, central state, it can do so. And so Leninist states are, one can argue, more capable of meeting public goods challenges, therefore. On the other hand, what they are not capable of is responding to bottom-up demands and even permitting. Why? Because they don't permit the aggregation of the demands in the first place, because they see civil society as threatening for the reasons of their analysis of Czechoslovakia and Hungary and Eastern Europe. Civil societies are proto-parties, and it's just a short step from being some sort of civic action organization around an environmental issue or something to becoming a green party. And that the example of the DPP in Taiwan is not lost to them. DPP got organized in the southern part of the island over the Lugang, I think it was called, nuclear power reactor. So unfortunately, and this is where I think the CCP has got to take a more relaxed attitude and realize that, in fact, empowering civil society can have two net effects. One, it'll take the pressure off the central state to deliver the public goods themselves, because civil society can share that burden. And civil society isn't necessarily a threat to the central state. It doesn't have to be. But I don't see the party state as having gotten intellectually to that point yet. They still see political power in zero-sum terms. Either we have it or somebody else has it. And they don't want to enfranchise civil society in China. Okay, so so public goods are going to be the big challenge. The question is, democratic states have some means to address these challenges, and including federalism and more empowered, in this case, provincial or local governments than the central government. So there's an excessive pressure, I would argue, on the central government to deliver public goods in China. And it's too big of a country to do that, as well-intentioned as Wen Jiabao is. So let me bring this to a conclusion, and we can have some question and answer and discussion time. So they've drawn all these conclusions, and I think you see it in these documents. You see it in the 17th Party report of Hu Jintao and the so-called scientific development concept, or his harmonious, socialist harmonious society concept. They've absorbed these lessons. They're saying the right things. They've learned what brought down these other regimes. How carefully they've really studied these sort of ex-authoritarian states that have transitioned to democratic states, I don't know. I've looked at some of that material. I think there's a lot more to be seen there, and I should do so. So I guess we'll leave it with a $64,000 question. What about the party's future? Is it going to come down or not? And I'll leave you with three concluding points. First, again, recognizing the fact that CCP does have a lot of vulnerabilities and liabilities, we would do well not to dismiss those. They are serious. Some of them are systemic. I would argue that corruption is systemic in China. The atrophied party cells is a serious problem. The party may be strong at the top, but it's not so strong at the bottom. It's tried, as Bruce Dixon's research has shown, to co-opt new elements, new social elements into the party. That's, I would argue, Bruce, another direct lesson learned from Eastern Europe and Hungary in particular, because these elites that formed outside the party in the East European states then became the core of the alternative parties in those states, in many cases, the GDR and Czechoslovakia and Poland in particular. So better to bring them under the umbrella, co-opt them, and hence try and control them than allow them to remain outside the umbrella. That's what the three represents is all about. But Bruce's research shows that it's not been entirely successful, this effort. They're trying, they have a lack of rule of law, lack of accountability and transparency. They have an ideology that doesn't have a whole lot of appeal, shall we say. So yes, this is a party in trouble. It's a party that's got some of the same generic afflictions that the Soviet and East European parties had. But they're trying to build what I would call a meritocratic technocracy. They're trying to improve the training and the competence of the cadre corps in very systematic ways, largely through the party school system and the public administration school system in China, mid-career training. If our civil servants in this country, or our public officials, our governors, our mayors, were subjected to the same extent of mid-career training as occurs in China, it would be wonderful, I think. If we had 2,800 party schools in this country, as they do in China, for mid-career training, 2,800, and every cadre is required to do 3 months, basically a month a year of mid-career training. All 46.4 million of them. It's a good thing. What are they learning? It's not just ideological brainwashing that they're being taught. They're learning tools of governance, counting management, public administration skills, as well as some ideology. So they're trying to build a meritocratic party state. They have already enforced the retirement norm and elite succession, chronic problem for communist states historically, including their own. Economic growth, no more to be said there. Integrated into the international economy, no more to be said there. Benefiting from globalization, absolutely. Not cut off from the world by like the USSR. And generally, China has a very effective and respected foreign policy, unlike the Soviet Union. Nor is it trying to export a system, as did the Soviet Union. So, there are some big differences. And these are all what I call the adaptive differences. So going forward, and I'll close here, is that enough? Simply learning the lessons of the Soviet Union. And I would say that's half the story. They've done well. They've drawn the right lessons there. But it's not sufficient to sustain themselves indefinitely. They're going to have to look at this delivery of public goods issue much more carefully. And I would just finish by saying that if you read, Wen Jiabao's and Hu Jintao's reports and other government party documents, they have absorbed that lesson. Rhetorically, they're there. They understand this. But in terms of resources and allocating the resources to meet the public goods demands, they are not there. Nick Lardy can give you statistic after statistic about the declined investment in public goods over recent years. So rhetoric and reality very much out of sync here. So we're going to have to look as the Hu-Wen government goes into their so-called second term, whether they begin to match the resources more to the rhetoric. But I think they're on the right track. So I will stop there, Bob, and we have half an hour or so, which I'd be happy to take your questions.
Well, thanks, David. I think everybody can see why we enjoyed having you with us so much during your year a few years ago. I note that you ended on a suitably ambiguous note as to the future, but maybe that's a good place to end. I want to ask the first question, David. Indeed, there are two related questions about these analyses and reports of the reasons for the demise of the Soviet Union, the collapse of the Eastern European communist regimes, as well as looking at other systems. How sensitive are these documents? Did you have difficulties getting them? If so, how did you get them? Are they available to any bona fide researcher? Are they available to Chinese people? I'd like a little bit more about whether or not it's remarkable that you even got them. The second question is a somewhat broader question. You haven't said it, but I gathered from the thrust of your comments that you were pretty impressed by the caliber of some of these studies in terms of sophistication, in terms of intellectual rigor. If that's true, does this tell us anything more generally about the level of intellectual or academic discourse or debate in China? For instance, do these reports, or more generally, do Chinese analysts now occupy a position where they can let the facts lead to a conclusion rather than a conclusion existing prior to the facts. So maybe a brief comment on both of these issues, please.
Those are two excellent questions in which to begin. First, the research is based both on documents and interviews. I spent several years going back and forth to China and interviewing the authors of the documents in some cases, and also party officials at different levels, mainly central levels. But most of these, 90+% of these publications are open publications. What in this town is called open source literature. It's not NABU publications, although there are, and I did gain access to a number of NABU studies, and there are some actually classified materials on this subject too, that are in fact readily available for purchase in bookstores in China. There is a 12 DVD set on the collapse of the Soviet Union that was mandatory viewing, so like 3 hours, for the entire Central Committee. And you can get that set. It's now sitting in George Washington University Gelman Library if you're interested in watching it. So I worked with a range of materials, but 90% of them are available to you or anybody in the audience if you know what bookstores in China to go to. And this, I think, is an important point. The Chinese Communist Party is a Leninist party. One of the key essence of Leninism is secrecy. But I would argue that it's a quite transparent party. Just like the Chinese military, there are two big myths in this town about China, that the Chinese military is not transparent. We heard it again last week with the DOD report. And the Chinese Communist Party, also not transparent. I say that's flat out wrong in both cases, and my previous book tried to prove that on the military side, and I think this book proves it on the party side. If you read Chinese and you know where to go to get the materials, both of these institutions, party and army, are very transparent about what they're doing, what their intentions are, what they've learned, where they're going. They don't reveal everything, but they reveal a lot. And so it's incumbent on the researcher to get the materials. And I would just, those who, every time I hear the charge that the PLA is not transparent, it says much more about the people making the charge than it does about the PLA. So that's your first question. And the second question, I think is really interesting too. The discourse and the research is now much more inductive rather than deductive. They don't know the conclusions they're going to get to. And the parameters of their research has broadened. I wouldn't say there are no parameters. They're not going to come out. You cannot come out and say Gorbachev was really a very well-intended reformer, and it's just, too bad that things didn't go his way. There are certain zones of territory you cannot go into. But within these sort of broad parameters, and people seem to understand it, and certainly linkage, you cannot be too explicit about linkages to China. But if you read between the lines, it's pretty clear what they're saying about their own system. But it impresses you, makes you realize that even in the most insular institution in this country, the Chinese Communist Party, there is this really vast discourse, very animated, lots of debates, big spectrum of opinion. Now, we know that's true in universities and on other subjects, but this is a very free society, I would argue. But even within the very unfree Chinese Communist Party, it's diverse and it's professional. And when you go and talk to these people, and you should generally read their work before you talk to them, they are serious academics, they're serious scholars. Yes, there's some ideologues, still in the crevices of some of these institutions, and you go in and you see them and they're still dressed in clothing from the 1950s, and you sort of think, gosh, where have you been? And they're still writing the same things they wrote in 1956. But generally speaking, I've been quite impressed by the people in the party school system and a number of other party institutes with whom I've interacted.
Good, thanks. I'm going to call on you one at a time. I would ask you to wait until we get the microphone to you, since we are being webcast. If you will briefly introduce yourself and then keep your comment and your question brief. I'm going to go Eric first and then Howard.
Eric McVaden, the Institute for Foreign Policy Analysis. Thank you, David. That was really enjoyable to listen to. I was intrigued by your calling the Chinese economy a unique hybrid. Maybe that helps explain some of the forecasts that have failed about that the economy was going to collapse. But my questions, Kaz Yost introduced me a few years ago to some folks from the Central Party School, and I was very impressed, very progressive. I didn't expect it to be that way. I wonder what role they're playing. And then the other role that I wonder about is one you and I have worked on together, and that's the PLA's role, either as the hammer or the party using it as the hammer. But anyway, I wonder if you'd comment on the role of the PLA and the party mechanism.
Oh, boy. Well, the party school, the Central Party School, as I say, is just the tip of the iceberg. There are 2,800 party schools in China. Things people don't really realize. Every province has dozens of them, and they're all involved both in mid-career training but also in designing the reform program. They have a simultaneous think tank role and training role, all of them. And there are also 3 new party schools, one in Pudong. That is the most extraordinary place I've ever been architecturally. If you want to go there, it's easy to get into, relatively easy. But the thinkers in at least the Central Party School have been quite eclectic and quite open. You might have read a report in the Washington Post just 3 weeks ago, by a Reuters report, in fact, about a new book that's come out on calling for democratic reform. But this is not an unusual new book. There have been numbers of articles and books published by people at the Central Party School or formerly associated with the Central Party School. The whole consultative democracy thrust right now comes from Li Junru, who's the vice president of the Central Party School. So it's a very unique institution, and there's some creative thinkers there, and there's some good work being done there. It has its, ups and downs, and it goes through some rather conservative periods sometimes, but overall it's well worth studying. And I have an article coming out in the China Quarterly on the party school system sometime in the next few months. So on your second question, the Army and the party, this takes us back too many years, Eric, in our various PLA conferences, about debates about, is this still a party army or not? And the answer is yes, it is still a party army. I mean, I sat here 5 years ago when the PLA book came out. Dennis Blair and I had this discussion. But the control by the party over the military has, I think, become much more elastic, and much more space is given to the military for its modernization program. And even the instruments of control, party control inside the military, namely the General Political Department and the party committee systems, meet much more infrequently. Officers may have to meet an hour a week now for so-called zhengzhi xuexi, political study. And even then they don't talk about politics. I see a basically marriage of convenience having been made between the party and the military, namely that if the party gets in serious trouble, as in 1989, that the military is the ultimate backstop to rescue it, as they did in 1989. But what's happened since '89 is there are a number of intermediate backstops, if you will, so that the PLA will not have to perform that internal security function. On the other hand, the party gives the military its resources to get on with military modernization to perform its external national security function. And I think there's been I argued in my previous book, a bifurcation is the term I use, between army and military, therefore. But that's the kind of my short view of the subject. But it's still a party army, and there are lots of debates in China about whether it should become a national army versus a party army. And of course, all the articles, including the one that came out this past week, arguing that under no conditions should our People's Liberation Army become a national military, shows you that, in fact, there's animated debate, that there is. There are advocates of national militaries in China. That's the way I read it anyway.
Howard.
Mm-hmm.
Howard Wiarda from CSIS. David, thank you for a wonderful presentation. I am a Latin America scholar, not a China expert. And confessions time, I'm the Latin America scholar that the Chinese are reading on corporatism these days. So thank you for that plug, which explains to me why suddenly there's an uptick in the number of emails that I'm getting from China, and why I've gotten 2 or 3 inquiries from Chinese graduate students who suddenly want to write doctoral dissertations on my work. How flattering. And why the Peking University Press, it's still Peking as distinct from Beijing, has recently translated 2 of my books. How nice of them to do. So you have now given me an explanation.
Trust you've gotten royalties, Howard.
Well, yeah. That's a whole nother subject matter, and a very sensitive one to me. But let me try very briefly to explain why that literature might be so attractive to the Chinese party at this stage. One is, I write a lot about the harmonization of society, and one can just see the Chinese thinking this is wonderful. Secondly, corporatism is a means to maintain control over social and political groups as they begin to emerge in a more modernizing and transitional society. Thirdly, it provides for a strong state rather than a checked and balanced state. In other words, it's state-directed development rather than private sector-directed development. There's also an emphasis in there on authority and control mechanisms, for example, while allowing just enough pluralism to keep the American democracy advocates and others happy. And finally, it emphasizes not just institutional arrangements, that's sort of Schmitter's position, but also the cultural basis of corporatism, which is very congruent, as you've indicated, with Confucian theory, and therefore fits into, I think, a lot of things that the Chinese are doing anyway, or would want to do. And I wonder if you might comment on whether I, as a non-China scholar, have read into the Chinese what I think they're thinking about some of my and others' own works in this area.
The Chinese would say, "Yo, Daoli, you have great insights, and you are going to get, if you haven't already, gotten an invitation to lecture at the Central Party School and brief the Politburo, because what you've written about and what you've just described is exactly where they're going and where they want to learn more about, and I myself want to learn more about, so I'll buy you lunch in a couple of weeks and buy your books as well." But I think you're absolutely right, and I plan, frankly, to go to Latin America this summer to learn more about Latin American-Chinese foreign relations, but my sort of alternative agenda is to learn more about how Latin American corporatism functions to understand this dimension of China.
Goyle, and then here, and then Mark.
Thanks very much. Raghuveer Goyal from India Globe in Asia Today. Great presentation. I see the book also out there. 2 quick questions. One, yesterday a report came on human rights by the State Department. It was kind of a little softer on China this year than compared to last year. And second, you think how much you think the U.S. should worry about the military buildup of China, especially here in Africa and also in Latin America and so on, because the DOD keeps saying that they really worry, but not that much. So what you have to say, since you are expert on China, that to the administration, that how much they should worry about China, and also as far as the economy is concerned.
That's 3. Let's just leave it at 2.
And I'm afraid I'm not going to try to answer either of the 2 because they're not related to the presentation I gave today. And I haven't read the State Department's new human rights report yesterday, and my views about the Chinese military are well captured in my last book, Modernizing China's Military.
Here, yes, lady here.
Okay, Joe, a fellow from National Endowment for Democracy. Thank you, David. I use your book a lot in my class. When I read your work, both the past and the new one, you give a sense that the Chinese government, especially the Communist Party, is leading this industrial revolution. It doesn't matter towards the corporatism or kind of more transparent revolution in China. I have to differ with you from that because I think that I like the word adaptation because it's the government adapt to the already social changes happening in China. So if we think that the role for the Industrial Revolution, let's say it's a new China Enlightenment, is a new revolution, new society happening in China, it is the government actually creating blocks towards this kind of enlightenment rather than building for the infrastructure. So for example, you can use the party school as an example to show how transparent government training their leaders. And then everybody knows that from China, party school is also a place for central government trying to make sure that the kind of de facto federalism you're talking about is not happening in China. It's kind of a club for the party leaders to socialize with each other and also to interact with center through kind of patronage. So make it transparency and also more individual liberty impossible. So what I'm trying to say is this, is that if we think individual liberty is the goal for Chinese people to reach, do you think the government is creating more possibility for that goal to reach, or they are trying to building more blocks to make that impossible to occur? At the same time, if you look at Chinese society, including civil society, is emerging, definitely in China, despite the government control. So in that aspect, if we talk enlightenment of Chinese movement, as I say, the government is totally not leading the movement, but actually creating barriers for this progress. Thank you very much.
Okay, well, thank you for your views. I wouldn't say that creating individual freedom is the goal of the Chinese Communist Party. So to begin with, that's not their assumption, certainly, and I don't think it's my assumption. And whether they're creating blocks, they're creating blocks to competitive multi-party democracy, yes. That's not their goal either. I try to be very clear about that. They're trying to increase different feedback mechanisms and consultative mechanisms within their one-party system. They're trying to make, they call it democratic. It's not the type of democracy that Jefferson or de Tocqueville would recognize. But in their own system, it's an improvement over the totalitarian past. But this is not, it depends on your perspective. If you're standing at the National Endowment for Humanities, I know what your goal in the world is. It's to spread democracy, American style, worldwide, right? You give lots of grants to countries and groups around the world to promote promote democracy, whatever style, American or otherwise. That's not the goal of the Chinese Communist Party. Their goal is to stay in power, and one way to stay in power is to try and broaden these feedback mechanisms and consultative mechanisms in their own system, and to modernize their country and maintain a strong state. That's why they're interested in this whole Latin American corporatist model. They don't want to go down the path of competitive party system yet. I can, however, foresee the day, and there's a very interesting, in chapter, I forget, 7 or 6 in the book, very interesting discourse by one Chinese academic about Singapore. We know that they have spent a lot of time looking at the PAP, or the People's Action Party, yeah, the PAP. It's also the People's Armed Police. And Lee Kuan Yew and the neo-authoritarian Singapore model. But this scholar argues that ultimately the PAP, and it's already happening in the last 2 elections, is subject to much more competition by the enfranchised political parties in Singapore. Singapore has at least enfranchised political parties, although there's been hegemony of the PAP over them. But this scholar argues that we can foresee a day when, in China, the other 8 democratic parties will compete in a multi-party contest with the CCP for whatever offices, local first, then county, then province, then national. This will take a while. And I can see that day, too, coming at some point, maybe 20 years from now. So I don't think competitive multi-party elections are completely out of the realm of possibility. Others, like Chung Lee, argue that a can let you speak for yourself, Chung-Li, but I think your view is that the factions in the CCP will emerge in a kind of Japanese style to be kind of competitive factions within a one-party system, if I understand your NBR article correctly. I have a hard time buying that because of the normative predisposition against factionalism in the CCP, even though it's been kind of endemic to the CCP from the beginning. I just don't think they can go down the LDP path and enfranchise within a CCP, if you will, a lot of acronyms here, I'm sorry, two or more really alternative competing factions. And maybe you and I need to have lunch or have a debate about this, but I have a hard time thinking that the Japanese model is really the CCP's future. I think the Singaporean model is, in fact, not just the PAP's neo-authoritarian hegemonic dominance, but in fact where Singapore is today, where there is a little bit more competition. So for you, those of you in the NEH or the NED, I wouldn't hold out a lot of hope that you're going to see democracy flourish in China. I would argue China already has individual liberty. Full stop.
Mark, and then David next.
Thank you, David. Mark Moore from the Wilson Center. As I was reading your book, I was thinking, you mentioned something about other books in the pipeline. And so I think a really good companion book to this would be a kind of view of, all right, the party is trying its best to adapt, just like, not just like, but, parties in the United States or political leaders try to, have traction, have connection with the people. So I was thinking a companion book is, what do the people make? Okay, there are 73 million people in the party. Well, it's China, so there are over 1 billion people who are not party members. What do they think? Because we all know, as I think it's stated in your book, and anybody who's lived in China or studied about China knows about the society's appreciation of wending, of stability, of peace and stability. And so, in a sense, the party has a certain amount of, I don't know what the proper term is, but, flexibility, leeway. The people will tolerate a lot because they know if, the party collapses, nobody wants to go back to the Warring States period, whether it's the early 20th century or the 3rd century BC or something. So the party has a lot of leeway. But, does the, average principal of a middle school in Beijing, does he think they're doing okay? I can see they're being more adaptive. I can email my complaints or something, and maybe sometimes I can get a response. Things are better now. The people of Beijing really didn't like what was going on in Beijing in 1989. Everybody was shooting, and those students got everybody in trouble, et cetera, et cetera. So, do you see this as a kind of companion to your book, or not? Are there reforms getting traction among the people? Thank you.
Well, trying to unpack that, there's a lot in your question. First, I would agree that there are some commonly held views by the Chinese public, all 1 billion plus of them, a consensus in favor of Wending for stability and Fuchang, wealth and power. This goes back a long time. We want to be individually wealthy and collectively wealthy, and we want a powerful China with dignity in the world. This goes back to the 1870s. So that, I think there's kind of normative consensus around things like that, that the party, and as long as China is moving in that direction and delivering those are also kinds of public goods, psychological public goods to the society, then the party gains legitimacy and credibility from delivering those psychological public goods to the society, and I would argue the party has done so in spades, in fact. So, unfortunately, the public opinion polling, well, it is taking root, but there aren't nationwide polls that go out and measure, are you satisfied with the Chinese Communist Party on the following criteria? They haven't quite gotten to that point yet. Although the party itself is using you ask about materials, the organization department of the party does a lot of internal polling and investigative reports about society's views. These feedback mechanisms, they are not unaware of discontent in the society. So, first point I would say is consensus, normative consensus around certain things the party delivers and that the party therefore enjoys legitimacy. Second point, there is unrest, 87,000 incidents of rural unrest in 2006, I guess it was. What are those incidences of unrest oriented towards? Are they oriented towards the Chinese Communist Party? No, they're oriented towards very localized grievances, individual cadres who may be party members, and that's where the local, what we call rent-seeking or local cadre predation, I like that term, which is Min Shin Pei's term, is really the Achilles heel of the party. They have got to get a grip on these predatory local cadres. Min Shin is absolutely correct, but he argues that they're not getting a grip. I argue there's some evidence, well, certainly they're aware of it, and there's some evidence that they are getting a grip. But these are not demos against the party per se, and they are not connected. There's no connecting tissue between these nodes of unrest across the country, if you will. So I would argue that the Chinese Communist Party enjoys popular legitimacy. Full stop. Sorry, our friend from the National Endowment for the Humanities wouldn't agree with that, though.
I'd like to recognize David Metzner. David is the vice chairman of our board of trustees, a stalwart in support of the Wilson Center and particularly for our China programming. David, it's good to have you here.
Bob, thank you for that generous introduction. I had the opportunity around 12 days ago to visit the party school outside of Beijing and sit with Zheng Bixie and discuss, I read his book before we sat down, and discuss sort of his insights from a 75-year perspective on the topic you spoke about today. And I've been scratching my head, and it just kind of confirmed what I heard today and being in Beijing in several meetings, and that is that, there's a problem sort of in U.S., I'm not going to say academic, but I'm going to say policy circles, that there's a tendency to look at a Leninist party as a Leninist party as a Leninist party, and we have this filter when we approach China. And having suffered through my graduate work, and through Soviet studies, I think I heard you correctly, is that, the Soviet Union really had morphed into more of a Stalinist party than really a true Leninist party.
Right.
And, my theory is that, we need, more scholarship, maybe bubbling out into the public policy process, that people need to be able to understand that this self-correcting, evolving process is happening, and I really don't sense it often being discussed here, and that's why when in fact, I actually gave Zheng Bixie your book when I was there, so that's why I wanted to come by and say hello.
Thank you. It saves me from sending him one.
So you agree that this sort of we're stuck in this sort of Stalinist analysis that we spent 40 years studying Soviet Russia, and now we can't take that sort of lens off our analysis when it comes to China.
Absolutely. And it is partially a kind of Soviet lens. It's partially the 1989 events in China that are still, that's what affects the American psyche about the Chinese Communist Party. They put together Chinese Communist Party, tanks, Tiananmen. End of story. And there is not, and there are several parts of this problem. I think you're absolutely right to notice it, particularly inside the Beltway. There is no attention really given to the party as an institution, much less as a reforming party. Our journalistic community doesn't help. When was the last time you read articles about the Chinese Communist Party? And, well, there are occasionally in New York Times. Joe Kahn writes usually 2 per year. Washington Post, some. It depends on the journalist. Ed Cody is interested in the party. His predecessor was too. But I think generally speaking, our print media are looking at other things in society. And their editors and their readers want them to look at other things in society. The Chinese Communist Party is not, a gripping topic for people living in Bethesda or even in think tanks on K Street. And it's regrettable. But there is some scholarship, that is being done in this area. And I mentioned the book that Brookings is going to publish next month that Li Chung is editing called China's Political Landscape. And this shows you very well, this book, the spectrum of views amongst the China specialist community on the party. And we need to give it much more attention than we do, but the military-industrial complex doesn't drive it the way it drives studies of the Chinese military. You want to do a study on the Chinese military, there are millions of dollars available to help fund it. But no, not so on the party side. But I think it's something we need. That's one reason I undertook this study. I had intellectual reasons, but I also thought this is, the ruling party of the largest country in the world, and it's at the heart of U.S.-China relations. What they are trying to do internally will define the trajectory of that country, and hence all countries that have to interact with it, not the least of which is the United States. So this is not a kind of idle academic question. So I think we need to interact with the Central Party School more. We need to translate these materials that are being written in China. The U.S. government needs to translate it. Scholars need to go in this direction. The Wilson Center needs to hold more events on this subject. I completely agree with the thrust of your question. Thank you.
We're just about at the end of our time. Back in the back, you've had your hand up the longest, so we're going to recognize you.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm Joe Davis. I'm from the American Federation of Teachers, and I'm particularly interested in the connection between the labor protests that are taking place in China and the recent contract labor reform, which I think is a reflection of some of the things that you are saying. But more importantly, I'm interested in the capacity of the ACFTU, it's the All China Federation of Trade Unions, to respond to these protests and to possibly institute some kind of negotiations or collective bargaining systems that might help address some of the labor issues that have resulted in the protests.
I wish I could respond intelligently to your question. First of all, a lot of these protests are rural, most of them, not by any means all, and hence don't involve the All China Federation of Trade Unions. They involve local cadres in the rural sector. But those that do involve are in the urban workforce. I don't know enough about it, but I could foresee a day, too, where the All China Federation of Trade Unions would be empowered to a greater extent and not viewed just as a united front tool of the party. But I haven't myself looked into that. The labor law, I think, is a significant piece of legislation, but like all pieces of legislation in China, it's all in the implementation. The proof's in the pudding is in the implementation. Bruce and I have a PhD student who's off in China now researching this. So we'll see what he finds when he comes back. But I just haven't looked into this area that much myself. But my hunch is that there will be greater latitude and empowerment of the trade unions, short of a solidarity. It's like everything else in China. Just as long as you don't cross that threshold of organized political opposition, then anything is possible.
David tells me I've been overlooking someone up front.
Gentleman in the third row has been very patient, too.
Well, then this will be the last question. You have to get to an airport, is that right? Yeah. David asked to leave for an airport. I think if we purchase copies of the book, he might have a few minutes to inscribe them before he leaves. You have the last question, sir.
Thank you very much. Bill Primosh with the National Association of Manufacturers. You didn't make any reference to the business community in China. That's getting to be a very influential group and a very wealthy group, according to the latest survey of billionaires. How are they looking at the party? And one would think that in a competitive global economy, and I bring even the perspective of American manufacturers, you don't have a lot of extra money to give around to patronage. And even Chinese corporations are facing that as the currency appreciates and other emerging economies are becoming competitive. Isn't this going to squeeze the party even more because there are less benefits to give out, less patronage?
Well, have I got a book for you? And it's not this book either. In fact, I have two books for you. 2 rows behind you is Professor Bruce Dixon, my colleague from George Washington University, who's already published one book called China's Red Capitalists, precisely on this question, and was a fellow here at the Wilson Center last year, writing in 6 months from now, I think Cambridge University Press will publish a second book on this subject. So I encourage you to meet Bruce when we adjourn, because I don't know that much about it. But as I indicated in my comments, the efforts to co-opt this class into the party have been undertaken. How successfully, I'll let Bruce speak to, but it's precisely, well, it's because of what you mentioned too. It's because of the fact that the party can no longer dispense sort of not just the goods, but the various things of life, of real life, the neo-traditional elements of life that they used to, so that you can get this in the marketplace today. So you have to ask, why does somebody, especially a wealthy businessman, want to become a member of the party? Well, as somebody having grown up in Chicago under Mayor Daley, I can tell you that political protection is an incentive for people who are in business, and the business party relationship, as Bruce's next book shows, is a very cozy one, as is the case throughout East Asia. This is not peculiar to China. And hence the party, you can argue, has become an elitist party, not just of meritocratic technocrats, but also corporate bureaucrats as well. But you two should meet each other when we adjourn. I'll give one more question. I can also stay till about 5 minutes to 6, but you've been very kind.
Thank you. My name is Samya. I'm a scholar at the Wilson Center. My question is, how do this party recruits its staff and its people? For example, college kids in China, what are their aspirations when they graduate? You know, like kids everywhere else. I want to become this. I want to join this organization. So is joining the party a priority for Chinese college kids?
Well, you should join this conversation with Bruce afterwards. He has data on this as well.
Bruce, get up.
My assumption is, what little statistics I've seen is that there are quite high percentages in the 30s percent of graduating classes, or around 30% of the elite universities are going into the party, or are being co-opted into the party. It's not just a voluntary effort in a sense, but this is the kind of party that CCP is trying to become. They want the best and brightest inside. But
I am going to adjourn it now. You can see why we were so pleased to get David here a few years ago, and why we're going to work like the dickens to get him back here. Join me, if you will, in a round of applause for David. Thanks to all of you as well. Don't forget, Valentine's Day is just around the corner, so buy an extra book for your sweetheart.